So the book club at my church just finished reading Tim Keller's The Reason for God, Belief in an Age of Skepticism. And in the first half of the book, Keller does a really good job of responding to some common objections that people have about Christianity. And in the second half of the book, he talks about the clues that sort of point towards Christianity being true. And so I just wanted to give sort of a high-level overview of each of the objections that he responds to in the first half of the book, and then maybe detail a little bit of the clues at the end, but not so much. So the first objection that Keller wants to respond to is that there can't be just one true religion. And so the first of the related objections is that all religions are the same. And the issue with that is that it assumes that doctrines aren't as important, the doctrines that constitute the religion, and that rather things they're sort of common to each other. They're very similar, and so this doesn't really make sense because the idea that doctrines don't matter is a doctrine in and of itself. So it's a bit of a self-contradiction, and so people in the religions that actually practice it do see the doctrines as a big difference. So a Christian does see the doctrines of Christianity as being fundamentally different from, say, the doctrines of Hinduism or Judaism. And so it doesn't really make sense to say that all religions are the same when the people that are actually practicing the religions don't see it that way. And also the person of Jesus really separates Christianity from the other world religions. And so it doesn't really make sense to say that they're the same because no one really treats Jesus the same way as Christianity does. So there you have it. The second related objection in this category is the idea that religion gets at only part of the truth, and each religion sort of gets at a different piece of the truth, right? And this claim that people will make is very snobbish and sort of they're assuming that they have the true enlightened view of God and they've sort of figured it out because they're so smart, and that religions are kind of blind and bullheaded and don't really understand. But you're such a smart person that you can see that all religions really point to the same part of the truth, or different parts of the same truth. But how can you really know that? How can you make that claim? It's sort of like a faith-based claim you're making. You don't really have any evidence for that, so it's kind of a strange thing to say. Another objection related to this is that religion is too historically or culturally situated. That doesn't really make sense to the modern person, or doesn't apply. And this assumption infers relativism. But absolute relativism, i.e. that everyone sort of makes up their own truth and morality, is a contradiction because relativism itself could be culturally situated in like the 21st century North American context, right? And so it doesn't really prove anything to say that, oh, religion is situated in its culture and it doesn't really apply to us, because your perspective on that, the relativism could be itself culturally situated. So again, another self-contradiction. And then I think the last one here, I believe it's the last one in this category, is that it is arrogant to convert others to your own religion. And this is another self-contradiction because this statement itself is made from an arrogant position that you expect others to accept. So if you say, it's actually arrogant to convert other people to your religion, you're expecting that other people believe and accept that statement, which is also arrogant. So again, another self-contradiction. So in general, what I want you to see from this first objection is that atheists make the same amount of faith-based religious claims as religious people do. When they say that God is unknowable or that he doesn't exist, that is a faith-based claim, just like the claim that religious people make that God is real. So it doesn't really make sense. So the second objection that Keller wants to respond to is the idea that how could a good God allow for suffering and evil on the face of the world? And Keller points out that evil is not evidence against God. So just because you can't think of a reason to justify all the evil and suffering in the world, that doesn't mean that there are no reasons, right? You're kind of just assuming that you've done an exhaustive search of all the reasons and you've concluded that there are no valid reasons. But of course, this is impossible to conclude. So he also points out that evil is actually evidence for God, because our moral ideals and our sense of justice are supernatural things, right? They cannot be derived from a materialist perspective on the world. And so people who claim to be atheists have no real moral ground to stand on. That ultimately their morality is arbitrary. And so only religious people have a serious claim towards correct moral action. And he also points out at the end of the chapter that Christianity gives us the tools to face suffering and injustice with hope and joy. The third objection that Keller responds to is that Christianity is stifling or is a straitjacket. And Keller asks the question in response to this, is the belief in absolute truth in opposition to freedom? So if you claim that all truth claims are power claims, then that statement itself is a power claim. So the idea is that people find Christianity stifling because if it's true, then they have to do certain things, act a certain way, abide by certain rules, right? And so these atheists will claim that truth claims are power claims because they restrict me. They restrict my freedom. But the idea that all truth claims are power claims is actually itself a power claim. And the idea is that the atheist is trying to obtain power over people of faith and sort of change what they believe. And so the same logic follows for the idea that all truth claims are just psychological projections, right? It just doesn't really make sense. So any community that makes truth claims and has moral boundaries will never be completely inclusive. So this is just because there are people out there that act certain ways and believe certain things that just will not be in accordance with the doctrines of the community or of the faith, right? So, for example, in Christianity, fornication is wrong, but certain people believe that's fine. It's not harmful. It's actually good. And so Christianity will never be completely inclusive because it actually says, hey, no, we're going to make a moral claim. That's wrong. And so they're not being inclusive towards that person. So the irony here is that inclusive communities are actually just as exclusive as exclusive communities. So like the church, since they share common values and principles, all right? So in any sort of community, they share certain common values and principles. And so the idea that they're being inclusive doesn't really make sense because they have shared ideals, right? Which will contradict with other people who don't share those ideals. So again, it doesn't really make sense. Keller also points out in this chapter that freedom is nuanced. So certain types of limitations can actually produce greater freedom in the long run than the lack of those restrictions. So for example, he uses the example of playing piano or practicing piano. So the idea is that if you don't practice piano, in the immediate future you have more free time to do other things, right? But if you are diligent about your practice, then eventually you'll get skilled, and then you'll have more freedoms, like the ability to teach piano, make money performing, or perhaps maybe you feel like playing a really nice piece by Mozart, then you have the freedom to do so, right? Because you have been diligent in your piano practice. So yeah, the idea there is that certain types of limitations can actually produce greater freedom in the long run. So he used the funny example here that I thought was really illuminating. And the idea is that a fish is only truly free if it's confined to water. Right? If you take a fish and you throw it in the middle of the Sahara and you're like, be free, it can move around, it can do whatever it wants, it has no restrictions. But it'll just die because it needs to be confined to water in order for it to be free. And this is something that our modern society misses, right? It thinks that the idea towards freedom is that freedom is freedom from restriction. But really, freedom is about freedom to do certain things and live a certain life and act a certain way. And this is the freedom that Christianity offers. Because the limitations that Christianity puts on us are things that produce our well-being and flourishing, because God knows us intimately, and He knows our temptations and our flaws, and also the things that produce joy in us. And so He's given us restrictions to promote our well-being, right? So in chapter 4, he responds to the objection that the church is responsible for injustice. In other words, the church is sort of a complicated history that doesn't really point towards its values, right? And so Keller points out that church, in fact, is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints. And the idea there is that sick people go to the doctor, and so you wouldn't expect to see a bunch of healthy people at the doctor's office. It doesn't really make sense, right? And that's the same logic you're kind of applying when you say that you're expecting people at church to be better than the average person. So broken people with poor upbringings are more likely to turn to God and improve a lot. But if you compare a healing person with an atheist who had a good upbringing, this is an unfair comparison. So kind of the same idea as what I was just saying about church being a hospital for sinners. So Keller also points out in this chapter that human societies always transcendentalize something or sort of deify something. So it isn't necessarily religion that aggravates people to violence. It's the people themselves, right? And oftentimes the thing that they deify will change their priorities and also cause them to be more or less prone to injustice and violence. So fanatic Christians that are like sort of maybe like hyper fundamental and kind of crazy are actually not hyper dedicated Christians. They're actually Christians, but sort of with a twisted gospel. And fanatics should be more Christian by being more loving, kind, compassionate, forgiving. And so the people you think are actually hyper religious by being super strict and pious, those people are actually less Christian than somebody who's compassionate and understanding. Another thing that Keller points out in this chapter that he likes is that people outside the church often criticize the church with the church's own moral system, which makes sense. So Keller just points out that the morality that they're applying to the church, even in its dark times where it hasn't really lived up to what it's supposed to be, that morality is actually found in the Bible. So it ties back to what I was saying earlier about atheists not having any moral ground to stand on. Sort of a connection back to that same idea. Keller finishes up this chapter on injustice by saying that violence has been perpetrated in the name of Christianity, but not by true Christians, because true Christians are people who are, like I said earlier, loving, kind, compassionate, forgiving, and peaceful, not people who are aggressive or hateful. In the 5th chapter, Keller responds to the objection that how can a loving God send people to hell eternally? And so he points out that our belief that we can change metaphysical reality to match our desires stems from the same impulse towards the physical world. So prior to modernity, people felt the opposite, that they should seek to conform themselves to reality, not the other way around. But unfortunately, due to cultural relativism, people living their own truth, people tend to try to force reality to match their expectations and beliefs, as opposed to the opposite. Right? And Christianity says that God is truth, and that we must reconcile ourselves to God. Keller also points out that God is angry at us for sinning because he loves us, not just because he's made the rules and he's wrathful, but rather he wants the best for us, and then when we sin and we break the relationship between God and us by introducing and allowing evil into our lives, he's actually angry at that because he loves us, not because, like I said, he's just trying to be a stickler. To close the chapter, Keller talks about hell and how people's understanding of it isn't exactly biblical. And so people think of hell generally, which is wrong, as a violent, wrathful judgment from God. But instead, hell is actually a freely chosen identity that's people create for themselves that is apart from God. So when a person distances themselves from God and their soul continues on this trajectory after they die, this is what is hell. And so the people in hell do not want to leave, even though they hate it there, because they would rather have their freedom or their sin than their salvation. And so nobody in hell is saying, sorry, let me out. Instead, they're just kind of reveling in their misery. In the 6th chapter, Keller responds to the idea that science perhaps has disproved Christianity. And the main way that he sees science in conflict with Christianity is through miracles. In particular, the resurrection, of course, but miracles more generally. And in order for science to function well as a system, it must assume only natural causes. But this does not mean that other types of causes do not exist. So the statement supernatural causes are not possible is not a falsifiable statement, and it isn't very scientific, right? But in order for science to function, it has to sort of assume that supernatural causes don't exist. But at the same time, if science tries to say that supernatural causes do not exist, it's overstepping its boundaries. Science actually doesn't have the authority to say something like that. Keller also uses this quote from Alvin Plantinga in response to the objection about science and Christianity. And Plantinga says that perhaps this person means to suggest that the very practice of science requires that one rejects the idea of God, and specifically God raising someone from the dead. This argument is like the drunk who insisted on looking for his lost car keys under the streetlight on the grounds that the light was better there. In fact, it would go the drunk one better. They should insist that because the keys would be so hard to find in the dark, they must be under the light, right? And so that sort of parallels the idea of natural versus supernatural causes, and how science is looking for God or proof for God in natural causes when God actually is a supernatural being, and it doesn't make sense for science to try to prove the existence or non-existence of God, because it only deals well with natural causes, not supernatural ones. Keller also points out here that even the disciples who seen the miracles firsthand, some of them doubted. And so the miracles aren't supposed to be easy to believe in. That's why they're called miracles, right? So I kind of like that. So in the last chapter in the first half of the book on objections, Keller responds to the idea that you can't take the Bible literally. And instead, Keller wants to argue that the gospel accounts are historically accurate. And of course, not just the gospel accounts, but the whole Bible. So he talks a lot about timing, the inclusion of specific names and dates, and the number of eyewitnesses that were alive when the Gospels were written and distributed. So the content of the Gospels, he says, is too counterproductive to be just a legend. So the Gospels do not take sides in early church debates to help certain people consolidate power, which would be expected if they were fake accounts. Too much crazy stuff went on in the Gospels, and the example he gives is that women were the first witnesses to the resurrected Jesus, and at that time, women really didn't have any say in court. They couldn't testify against or for somebody, and so having women see Jesus as the first witnesses is really very counterproductive to the narrative of the Gospel, and Keller basically says that the only way that would be included in the Gospels is if it was true, right? Because otherwise it doesn't really help the credibility of the Gospel. Gospels are also too detailed to be legend. So I don't remember the exact quote from the book, but Keller was basically saying that if the Gospels are fiction, then some mysterious writer out of nowhere just anticipated the entire idea of a novel, because that genre didn't really exist. They just had like myth and then historical accounts. So somebody just invented the idea of like a realistic novel, and then that genre just disappeared again for like 1,000 years, which is to say that it's not like a fictitious novel. So it's just a wrong genre. Like that sort of writing style didn't exist at that time. Keller also points out the irony in the idea that people take issue with the Bible's morals. They say it's maybe culturally regressive, doesn't respect women or something like that. But Keller points out that if God is real, then why would his values conform to what you think is correct or not correct? They would just be what they are, objective. And so it kind of doesn't really make sense for you to criticize the Bible's moral system because it's from God. And also on that same note, Jesus' teachings, whether he said this or that, does not invalidate his resurrection, right? If he rose from the dead, he rose from the dead and he said what he said, right? So it doesn't really make sense to again, like judge what he said based on your own values and moral system. And if you force God in the Bible to conform to your own values, then you're not worshiping God, you've actually created your own God. So yeah, that's the first half of Tim Keller's book, The Reason for God. I think I'll leave out the second half. It's good, but this video is getting kind of long already, so yeah. Those are the responses to some common objections. So if you find any of those convincing, that's great. Maybe go to church on Sunday. See ya.